Without question, I think his most significant accomplishment was the establishment of El Centro de la Raza. And when I say the establishment, I don't even mean the taking over of the building, although obviously that was an important anchor, physical anchor for El Centro. But it was the establishment of the philosophy, it was the establishment of a community on the hill for all peoples.
He became leader of a movement in the Latino Chicano community.
There's no question that Roberto created the Latino movement here in the Pacific Northwest. Without him, I don't think we would be as far along as understanding the Latinos and the issues and the problems that face them. He's the one that was really the heart and soul of the community. And this is not to say that others weren't involved or others weren't successful, but in terms of who was the actual face of the community, Roberto Maestas was the face, he was the heart, he was the soul of the Latino community.
And, you know, he knew people all over the world.
He led about 50 delegations of Americans to Nicaragua in a period of a 10-year span. And I point to him, I think that Roberto is the one person who probably prohibited or kept President Ronald Reagan from invading Nicaragua, because he had more people on his delegations from the United States to Nicaragua than any other foreign dignitaries or whatever have you in Nicaragua. There were always a lot of Americans there, thanks to my buddy Roberto.
He was not only local, he became more national and international with some of the things that he was doing. He cared about people, regardless of where poverty was, whether it was in our backyard or his backyard on Beacon Hill, or if it was in Cuba or if it was in South America, he cared about it. He cared about people.
I was living in New York City, and at the famous Riverside Church, President Fidel Castro from Cuba spoke. He was allowed to come into the U.S. to address the United Nations, which is in New York City, but he was not allowed to leave the city. So he couldn't go traveling around the country and giving speeches in different places, so he only spoke in New York City, and he wanted to speak to the people, so he spoke at Riverside Church. And I was sitting there. President Castro has a way of talking for like 4 or 5 hours straight. And so people get restless, and people leave, and people come, and people go. And at one point I was sitting there by myself, wondering how much longer the speech was going to go. And here comes Roberto up the main aisle of the church. He had been sitting down in front. And he sees me, and he sort of yells my name out, you know. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he comes over, and he sits down, and he gives me a big hug. And he had flown to New York just to hear Fidel speak. You know, that's, I mean, you never knew where he was going to pop up.
If you talk about sports, he was always the best basketball player in the world, or he was the best track runner in the world, or he was the best boxer. And one time he was talking so much so I said, well, okay, Roberto, if you're so good at basketball, why don't you play against Bill Kendrick, the former superintendent of the public schools? And if you win, you could have El Centro. And if you lose, you have to shut up. And, you know, of course, he's up there talking, yeah, well, you know, I can get Bill. But Bill's a lot taller, plus Bill played, you know, high school and college ball and stuff, so he's a good athlete. But when it came down to the actual week, all of a sudden, Roberto got sick and didn't play.
Roberto owned a basketball court at El Centro de la Raza, and as the story goes, and I've heard this version from there's 3 of the participants, that Roberto challenged a group, which included, by the way, Dave Okimoto and Bob Santos, Jamie DeYoung, challenged them to a basketball game. And he, you know, his competitiveness got the better of him, and he offered up El Centro de la Raza as the prize. Of course, Bob stepped up and said, well, if you feel that strongly about it, you know, I'll bet the ID. Needless to say, I won't go on to say exactly who won the game, just to say that it was a highly competitive match, and El Centro is what it is, and the ID is what it is.
He was also a fighter, and he told me one day, this was several years ago, he says, Bobby Saintly, that's what he called me. Bobby Saintly, I heard you were a boxer. Do you think you could have beaten me at that time when you were younger? We were both younger. I said, yeah, I think so. He said, I was a tough guy, I had a lot of fights. I said, I know that, I heard about that. You were in jail too because of all stuff like that. And then he'd say, could you think you could beat me now, today? And I said, Roberto, we're into our 70s now. He says, well, we could do a fundraiser. So one day he comes into this event, and he's hanging on Stella, and he has a cane. He broke his foot playing basketball. So I ran up to him and I said, this is it, Maestas, this is it. Let's get our gloves on now. He said, Bobby Saintly, I broke my foot. I didn't break my jaw.
When all was said and done, Roberto always came back to his love of kids. And there were a couple times where Roberto and I profoundly disagreed on issues, and we would argue, and we would fight, and at the end of the meeting he would say, well, Tokuda, how's that Molly doing? And then he would go on to say, kids are our future. So I think that's what I will remember Roberto for.
He loved all children, but to see him playing with his little kids, whether they were the children of his children or whether they were the children of El Centro, you saw pure joy in Roberto's face.
He would see the children, and he would never bend over to talk to the children. He would always kneel down so that the children could see him eye to eye, and he'd speak to them in Spanish. And even though they didn't understand Spanish, the way he spoke to them, the children knew that he was talking about love and caring. And that's what I remember about him.